Hello, I'm Ray Jones, Pike County Judge Executive, and we're here today to provide an important update on the COVID-19 pandemic. It is September 11th. As we all remember what happened 19 years ago, our country faced a serious crisis, and we're in the middle of a serious crisis now. Joining me on the program today is Pike County Public Health Director Tammy Riley and Dr. Fadi Alacross, who is the Director of Infectious Disease at Pikeville Medical Center. Let me welcome both of you onto the program and thank you for all the work that both of you have done throughout the pandemic to keep Pike Countyans and Eastern Kentuckians informed and safe. We're going to jump right in, and Tammy, if you would you provide an update to the public on the number of cases that we have currently here in Pike County active, the number of people recovered, and the other pertinent statistics about where we stand.
Sure. Thank you, Judge, for having me today. And what we'll do is we'll look at a slide showing the recovered and deceased and total active cases. And there's some good news in the numbers actually today. As you referenced, today's Patriots Day is September 11th, and as of this morning, we have 366 cases. Unfortunately, we have lost 3 Pike County residents since the beginning of the pandemic. 32 of these cases are active. The good news is that 331 individuals have recovered. Our very first case occurred on March 31st, which was several weeks after the first case in Kentucky early in March. And I have a slide to show like the trending of cases since that time. Since that first case in March 31st through this past week. And I'll look at the numbers on a daily but also a weekly basis so we can look at trends. And what I find interesting with this graph, this is on our PikeCountyHealth.com website, is you can see how early on, businesses, the economy really slowed, our interactions and activities, definitely our mobility slowed. And you can see how we fared for many, many weeks. And what you see is quite interesting, that first really significant spike there with 51 cases in 1 week occurred approximately 2 weeks after the 4th of July holidays. And then what occurred directly after that is reflects the outcomes of the mask mandate, which occurred on July 10th. So the July 10th mask mandate and the holidays, you can see the spike, and then you can see we saw as public health officials increased compliance in mask observance, and the numbers plateaued, and then they actually dipped down fairly low. And then, as we all know, school activities resumed, youth sports resumed, and college students returned to college. And as a result of that, we're starting to see another spike. So I wanted to point that out. So last week we had 31 cases. And
any idea why we're seeing a spike now? You think it has to do with school activities?
What we're seeing as school activities, we're also seeing the July 10th, directly after the mask mandate, there was a really great compliance, an increase in face coverings when you're out in public. And what I'm observing, just simple observation, is that there has been some relaxation in those behaviors, and then also college students. And not only local college students, but our own kids who are going away to college, and if they test positive, what happens is most students want to come home. They're not feeling well, they're scared, so they come home to mom and dad, and they isolate here, so those numbers come back to Pike County. So what we're seeing is some 19, 20-year-olds either that are local or they went somewhere to college and they've come home to isolate. So that's part of the reason for the spike that we saw last week and relaxed behaviors.
One of the things that you hear people talk about, I think it's fair to say, there's a lot of people that just don't believe that this is real. You hear people say, Dr. Fadi, you've probably heard people say, well, it'll end after the election. And that really doesn't take into account that this has not only affected the United States, it's hit every country on the globe. And there have been hundreds of thousands of people die globally because of this. How would you respond to that? How would you respond to people who don't believe this, Dr. Foddy?
Basically, the COVID-19, or in other terms, we have to call it like SARS-CoV-2 infection, is a true infection. It's a real deal. And we've been seeing that problem going on for the last few months. And if you look globally, the number is going up. In the United States, the number is getting much better because I think we're becoming more compliant with our restriction policy, with masking, with hand hygiene, with 6-foot distancing. But this is definitely a problem that's going to linger for a long time. And based on all that we know, that vaccine is going to be the only solution to come over the problem. So we have put too much effort, and we're putting too much money now in the market to come with a vaccine. The most importantly should be safe and effective, and hopefully in the next few months we'll find one. But this is definitely a real deal. This is a very contagious infection with long incubation period, easy to be transmitted from one person to another person. And now we see more infection in the young population. As Mr. Riley mentioned and alluded just a few minutes ago, about the increased number in the young population going to college, more contact, sharing the room with other people, because we know very, very well that one student doesn't basically have the same room. They share the room with other people, and having that kind of contact, especially close contact, will increase the risk of transmission because the virus will take any opportunity to move from one person to another person. So that's the problem now in the young generation. If you look at the CDC number now, 20% of hospitalization happening in the young population. Vaping is a major issue now, and I'm going to basically talk about it. If you look at the number of vaping now in the young population, it's crazy high. And we know that vaping has nicotine, very rich in nicotine, as well as chemicals that can cause damage. And there is a disease called EVALI, which is definitely leading to a lot of scarring tissue in the lungs. So all these definitely paving the road and increasing that opportunity for the virus to spread from one person to another person, especially in the young population.
We also hear people say, well, it's not as bad as the flu. It's like a cold. People aren't even really getting sick with it. What are you seeing in the hospital setting? Not only people from Pike County, but people from the region that are transferred into Pikeville Medical Center.
So we have definitely sick people coming to us with COVID-19. So this can affect people, especially the vulnerable ones, people with high age, 65 and older, even like 50 and older, we're seeing it now. In addition to all other comorbidities, lung disease, heart disease, diabetes mainly. And we've seen recently there is bidirectional relationship between diabetes and COVID-19. So diabetes will increase the chance to catch COVID-19. And on the other hand, COVID-19 can cause diabetes issues. So there is some sort of bidirectional relationship between COVID-19 and diabetes. So these people with these underlying comorbidities, they're going to suffer complications. Now, on the other hand, we cannot predict who's going to be the one who's going to be in the hospital. We know that 40% of the patients or the people who got infected with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, they have no symptoms. And the problem with these people, they can spread it inadvertently to other people. That's why we keep pushing for the mitigation measures as the main tools at this point to prevent transmission of the infection. But this is a serious issue. This is a pandemic problem going on across the whole globe. We have sick patients coming to the hospital. Some people, they require ventilation, they require pressors, they have multi-organ failure. And this is all related because the virus will attack mainly the inline of your lungs. There is a receptor called ACE receptor that found on main vital organs, and the virus will dock on and create major inflammation tissues, mainly in the lung, leading to lack of oxygenation and depriving vital organs from these oxygenation. So yeah, we have sick patients basically admitted to the hospital, and this is a serious problem. It is very disrupting to us because we don't know who's going to suffer these complications. So we have to be very humble when it comes to COVID-19. Nobody knows what's going to be the consequence of COVID-19 infection.
What are your observations about the prognosis for patients that end up on ventilator support?
Now, in the past, the prognosis was much worse compared to now. Now we are learning too much, a little bit more about the COVID-19 situation. We're gaining too much knowledge. We have more hands-on options now. We have viral therapy called remdesivir. We have the steroid, and all the studies now showing that it has a huge impact on mortality, especially on people who are on mechanical ventilation. We have access to convalescent plasma, which is some sort of blood product that's rich in antibodies that you give it to some people who are suffering the devastating complication of COVID-19 to block all these inflammatory processes from going on in the body. We have more knowledge about how to use our mechanical ventilation and try to save them for later events. So I think with that kind of knowledge now, we have much better mortality compared to before. And if you look in general, the mortality has come down from 12% in general to 8.5%, which is great now at this point. But we need to do a little bit better. We don't have FDA-approved medication. We don't have a licensed vaccination so far. So that's why we have to be very humble with that situation until we find it soon.
Now, when you talk about mortality down to 8%, are you talking about
In general.
Of the people who are diagnosed?
Yes, sir, in general. If you look basically just specifically about the ventilation, we still have very high mortality, 40-50%. So this is definitely high mortality compared to the general population.
I know that there's been, the hydroxychloroquine has been a very controversial subject politically. What about from a medical standpoint? Are those drugs still being used, or have they been removed from frontline therapy?
So hydroxychloroquine, based on in vitro studies showing some good efficacy against SARS-CoV-2, there is some sort of antiviral activity against the virus, and this has been proven by many studies. However, you cannot utilize that data to tell people that it's going to work in humans. So you have to experience that in some sort of studies. And to prove the efficacy of any medication, you have to do what's called randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials, you have to take two arms. One group with no treatment and one group with treatment. This is the only way you can compare medication versus placebo and find out about the adverse reactions and about the efficacy, and you can compare head-to-head the mortality and the adverse events of the medications. Unfortunately, at this point, we don't have any randomized controlled trial for hydroxychloroquine, and this is basically the hiccup about the whole process. Yeah, in reality, is it working? I don't know, because all the studies we have are retrospective analysis. And anytime you talk about retrospective analysis, which means that you take a bunch of patients, you look at their records, and you try to draw a conclusion from that. It's very hard to tell if this is statistically significant or not, because you are not truly comparing them at the same time to find exactly what's going to be the outcome. So what you can draw from retrospective analysis, hypothesis. It is very favorable, yes, but you need to put it into action. And the only way I can prove it by doing randomized controlled trials.
So at this point, there are no studies that really confirm that it works or doesn't work.
There is no randomized controlled trials that can prove the efficacy and decrease mortality for hydroxychloroquine at this point. There's a big study done in Henry Ford recently, but this is all retrospective analysis of thousands of patients. But again, anything it comes to retrospective analysis, you cannot draw any conclusion. There is no solid conclusion that can be taken from these analyses.
Is that because a lot of patients are going to recover?
It's not only that, because when you look backward, you cannot basically take that right conclusion. You have to do it at the same time, run two arms at the same time, compare placebo versus treatment, and you need to compare the efficacy and the side effects at the same time. Unless you do them running in prospective analysis, which means that you take at the same time and you run the study at the same time, it's very hard to draw any conclusion.
Now, let's go back to Tammy for a second. Tammy, one of the issues that a lot of people have concerns about, myself included, is that we have schools that are going to be going back later this month, and there's some school reporting issues and things like that. Can you talk about that a little bit for us?
What I can tell the public is that public health is working very closely with the school systems. You know, we have an independent school system and a county school system in Pike County, and we work very closely with those individuals. They have, for each school, they have a safety school officer. And in Pike County, this is not statewide. In Pike County, we developed our own investigative form that we will share with the school safety officer, where we work in conjunction with each other, so that contact tracing and the entire disease investigation can happen very thoroughly, but also with sharing the minimal amount of information that's needed regarding the patient. So we do have that in place. We work very closely with those school systems. And then the school systems as well are reporting their cases to the state. And we also report information through REDCap to the state, any student related. And that also applies to post-secondary schools. in the area. So we work with the University of Pikeville as well. As a matter of fact, they took the form that we had and created a cloud-based form, Google form, where we work with them with their cases, so that we do a very thorough tracing and investigation, and that information is reported. You can actually, that's public information, and you can go to kycovid19.ky.gov, and on, I believe it's on the right-hand side of the landing page, there's a public school and university report link. It just says post-secondary and school report. And you click on that link and it gives you all of the information of cases related to specific schools.
So we've got a couple weeks before school goes back, and we're in the middle of a spike. Mm-hmm. So what's the health department's role in trying to figure out, okay, we're in the middle of this sort of upturn. We're a threefold increase this week compared to last week. Where does this go? If the spike continues, if we see another increase in cases next week, where does the health department go from there?
Well, that's why we watch the data, and I look at the information on a daily and a weekly basis, and we work very closely with the Department of Public Health. And when I say we, I'm talking about an entire team. I work with a nurse administrator, nurse practitioners. We have a state epidemiologist, and then we have the Department of Public Health at the state level, that resource as well. So we work very closely with them, monitoring the data, not only on a daily, but a weekly basis. I share that information with the decision makers at the school level.
And I know that you've been in regular contact with Mr. Reed Atkins, who's done a great job with the Pike County Board of Education, his superintendent of schools.
Yes.
And Mr. Trimble, I know you've been in contact with him as well. Are the plans that they have in place, I guess, fluid, subject to change based on what we're seeing with the data?
They have worked very closely with me, yes. And they do have a plan. The independent school has a hybrid flex plan. They have, it's a very thorough plan where they have a group A and a group B that for in-person school, where they will alternate those days, giving them Friday for a deeper clean. And then they have their virtual academy where they're using a platform. Their learning management system is Edgenuity for those students that want to go all day virtual. And then the county school system has a system that's 5 days on, you go every day, or you stay home every day for virtual. And they're using Canvas, which I'm very familiar with Canvas, as a learning management system for their platform. And so we'll work with them very closely. As of today, we do not have a rubric or a metric, so to speak, to go by. West Virginia has a metric system where there's certain criteria if you're in a certain zone with case growth, with rates per 100,000 that they go by. And then if you're in the green, yellow, orange, or red zone, then that determines, school sports, in-person or virtual. And that's something that we're probably looking at in the state of Kentucky, but has not been implemented at this point.
Now, we're also back to school usually means the start of flu season as well.
Right.
And the health department, I guess, is gearing up for its regular flu vaccination drive that the health department's done for many years.
Yes.
Could you talk about that, and then we'll get Dr. Foddy to jump in about whether he recommends a flu shot?
Absolutely, and I certainly hope that he does, and I feel quite confident
that he will. I think we know the answer to that.
I feel very confident in his answer. But yes, flu vaccinations are, if there's anything that you can do outside of the 5C plan, clean, cover, contain, do your civic duty, and remain calm, anything that you can do outside of that 5C plan, the next probably most important thing you could do right now is get your flu vaccination, get it early. It's really hard to walk down any street corner and not find a pharmacist, a private provider, a clinic, or of course your reliable and trusted local health department that wouldn't provide a flu vaccination for you. So I'm hoping to see increased compliance in flu vaccination. That's what's very concerning for public health, as I'm sure as any healthcare or informed citizen is with flu season coming on, and we've already dealt with seasonal allergies. And there's, an overlap of symptoms with seasonal allergies, but there's some significant differences between seasonal allergies and COVID-19. You can see on the screen, with seasonal allergies, you don't get a fever, you don't get muscle aches, chilling. Typically, you can lose a sense of smell, but typically with seasonal allergies, you don't see a loss of sense of taste or smell. With seasonal allergies, what's more typical is itching, running, watery eyes, and sneezing. So there's some significant differences between seasonal allergies and COVID-19. That's not so much the case with influenza. The waters, to use a metaphor, become a little muddier to distinguish between influenza, and I'll let Dr. Faudy address that. But it's very important now more than ever that we have increased participation with vaccination for influenza.
And I guess it's possible, doctor, that people could contract both influenza and COVID at the same time.
It is definitely, this is a possibility because the mode of transmission of these viruses are almost the same. So we're talking about droplets, and we're talking about fomites when you touch basically some surfaces and you put it on your mouth and your nose, and this is the way how you contract the infection. So this is more important than ever to receive the flu shot. Although people, they argue this is not 100% effective, however, it will give you plenty of protection. Even if you catch the infection, it's going to be way milder, which means the symptoms are going to be mild, a little bit of muscle ache, a little bit of fever, but this will protect you to the point you don't need to go to the hospital for the flu. So the flu is very important at this point amid COVID-19 situation. On the other hand, if you have somebody really vulnerable and you're young, if you take the flu shot, you protect that vulnerable from catching the flu from you. So this can be protective not only to you, but also to your loved one and to your vulnerable one. And especially now during this season going back to school, this is more important than ever to give the flu shot to kids. Because many times we have to stop school just for the flu. Not because of COVID. We had it multiple times in the past that we have outbreaks of flu and we have to shut down the school for that. So we don't want to take any excuse now to shut the school for other reasons. We have to make sure these kids are vaccinated. And I know plenty of these kids are behind the schedule for 1 or 2, 3 months. So here I will definitely send a message to the parents to make sure they follow with the pediatrician, especially for the kids, and make sure they receive their vaccination on time. So I highly recommend vaccination, especially flu vaccination amid COVID-19.
In terms of symptoms of the flu versus symptoms of COVID, I know there's some overlap. Fever, body aches, cough. What are the differentiating symptoms?
So in general, they have almost the same symptoms. Upper respiratory manifestations with runny nose, cough, sore throat, muscle ache, fever. So these are common between COVID-19 and flu. I think the major difference is what's unique for COVID-19, that loss of smell and taste is almost unique. On the other hand, the complications that we've seen with COVID-19 more frequent than the flu. And this is probably related because people are receiving vaccination for the flu. At this point, we have no vaccination for the COVID-19. But the complications and the mortality from COVID-19 now is way high than the flu. And that's why if we are dealing with COVID-19, let's us focus on COVID-19. We don't want to mud the water. Make sure that everybody get vaccinated for the flu and get that problem away from the picture.
When you're talking about an 8% mortality rate that goes much higher if someone's on a ventilator. The statistics that I've seen over the years, my allergies are kicking in. The statistics for the flu in terms of mortality is usually less than 1%. Is that accurate?
If you're talking about in general, somewhere between 0.2, 0.3%.
If you think about the flu, typically when you look at the influenza mortality, just going back a few decades, what public health sees is anywhere between 20,000 and 60,000 deaths due to influenza, depending on the season and what's happened and participation with vaccination. We've had over 189,000 deaths in the United States alone, and we're only 6 months into this. So the comparison of mortality between influenza and COVID-19, it's like trying to compare an apple to an orange.
Well, and some studies now are saying that you could see 400,000 deaths before we have a vaccine, and we're halfway there. So jumping to the vaccine, where are we, as the United States, World Health Organization, other groups that are trying to develop vaccines. I know you keep up with that pretty closely.
I think this is an extremely hot topic because based on what we've seen and based on what we try to do, it's going to be impossible to get through COVID-19 situation without vaccination. And if you look at all the studies now, I think almost 200 companies are currently in the race of making vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. The bottom line, we need something really safe. We need something effective because you're going to give it to young patients. You're going to give it to the young population who are healthy. They have no problems. And we need to determine that these vaccines are extremely safe for this kind of specific population. On the top of that, we need also to make sure that if I give it to elderly people, it's going to be effective as well. So it's going to be early at this point to tell if these are going to work well or not. But based on the preliminary data, we have phase 1 and phase 2 trials that have been published in the literature showing that vaccine from multiple companies are capable of producing neutralizing antibodies for the COVID-19. On the top of that, which is more critical, it can stimulate the immune system, mainly the T cells, to develop what's called memory cells, which means if your antibodies are waning down and you get re-exposed to the virus, these cells would jump on and develop the antibodies immediately, blocking the virus from causing sickness. And that's why I like to make the distinction between the two entities. Infection and disease are totally different. So you can be infected but not having symptoms, and that's the beauty about the vaccination, to protect you from developing the disease, and this is what we need from these vaccinations. At this point, we have 9 studies or 9 companies are in phase 3 trials, which is great. And these phase trials are all based on randomized controlled trials. So they take 2 arms, placebo, vaccination, and they have to follow these patients for a certain period of time to determine what the side effects and what the problems coming from the vaccination and what's the protection coming from the vaccination. To be FDA approved, you need to prove the 50% efficacy at least in the vaccination population. Now, the most common ones now, and I think the front runners now in the race of COVID-19 are Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, or these the main companies are in the race now, which is very surprisingly, like a couple days ago, AstraZeneca already held all the vaccination trial because there is unexplained illness going on one patient that developed what's called transverse myelitis, which is an inflammation of the spinal cord. And that patient now having basically consequences from that, he's in the hospital, or she, I don't know, he or she, that person is in the hospital and they do an investigation to figure out if this is coming from the vaccine or not. So there is separate committee that now in the trial, and they're trying to find out exactly if this is related to the vaccine or this is something coincidence happening at this point.
You hear people talk about whether they're going to take the vaccination. Obviously, the FDA will have to approve any vaccine before it can be distributed to the public.
Absolutely.
What's your position on that? Would you feel safe taking the vaccine if it's approved by the FDA?
Now, if the studies is going to be released in few months and based on analyzing large number of patients, here we're talking about thousands of patients, I'll feel very comfortable taking the vaccination. But if we're going to do shortcut on that and just do analysis on few hundreds or few thousands, I don't think this is going to be the safest thing. Because again, going back to the point, I'm going to give that vaccine to somebody who's completely healthy, young, 20, 21 years old, 18 years old, young people. I want to make sure that that vaccine is very safe and very effective. And the only way to do that is to run bunch of thousands of patients for a little bit long period of time to be able to catch all these small things that may happen in real life.
And a lot of people may not think about it, but vaccines have really saved untold millions of lives. Polio, smallpox, measles, mumps, all those diseases that were at once prevalent, and now even diseases like shingles, there's a vaccine.
Correct.
How, if you have someone say to you, I'm afraid of vaccines, I don't believe it, and there's this anti-vaccination movement in the United States. Some parents don't want to give their kids vaccines. How do you respond to that?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's why I'm talking about the safety and efficacy of vaccination, because we have a lot of resistance from people taking vaccination. So if we make any faux pas in that process of making vaccine, this is going to affect the whole vaccination program in the United States. So we need to be very diligent about how we're going to proceed with the vaccination. We need to prove it 100% safe to make sure that people are taking the right vaccination and to protect them from the COVID-19. Any mistakes in that process will affect other vaccination, including flu, like measles, rubella, anything, because people will lose trust in the results of the vaccination studies, and this will affect the whole vaccination program. We don't want that. That's why we need to make sure that we have enough time to make sure that the medication and or the vaccination is safe and efficacious. And I think in 3 months or 4 months, this is not enough. If you look at all the prior studies, you need years to prove the vaccination is effective. So here we do some new and innovative studies now in the vaccination formation. So we go into what's called genetic vaccination, when we use the messenger RNA to create the vaccine, which is something very innovative. So we take a piece of the gene, push it in the body, and make our body producing these protein and subsequently creating antibodies to that. So we have several platforms. Or the old platform, when you take the vaccine, you take the virus and you attenuate it, you kill it, and you push it in the body. So we have several options now in the market. They may work, they might not work. So that's why I'm saying we have to be very humble for that. Unless we prove it effective and safe, I don't recommend it to people.
I would like to add something, though. There have been some steps put in place that will expedite a vaccine that does not affect safety. And for example, normally you would not mass produce a vaccine at the beginning of the third stage of the study, of the trial. But FDA, because of the public health emergency, has given unprecedented permission. My understanding, I'm not sure of the exact number, but a certain number of those 8 studies, a certain number of them have been given permission to go ahead, going into the third phase, to mass produce. Therefore, if one does show efficacy and safety, it will already be produced. And the reason why that's unprecedented is it costs a lot of money to do that. So the companies are basically gambling that their product will prove both, will show efficacy and safety. And if it does, it'll already be mass produced and ready to go, which is one of the reasons why, as public health, we're preparing in the event that one does, so that we can dispense.
So the companies are taking the financial risk, but there shouldn't be any problem with the safety and efficacy.
Correct.
So that kind of part shouldn't affect on the pace of developing a safe vaccination.
Right.
The other issue here, that United States is already pumping a lot of money for the development of vaccination. We have billions of dollars going towards these companies. So in other way, these companies already paid for doing this. And the reason they do mass production is just to cut down on the time.
Right.
Once it's approved, they can deliver directly to public and save a lot of time, because that production part is very long process.
It is.
And you need to make sure that once you make these vials, you need to make sure that these vials are safe, and the product can be basically given safely to people once it's approved. I think the companies are gambling financially, but we cannot gamble on the safety and efficacy of vaccination.
But those are shortcuts that do not, my point is, those are 2 shortcuts that do not affect safety. Mass producing prior to the end of the third stage of the trial, and investing more money in the trial. Those are 2 unprecedented shortcuts that don't impact safety and efficacy.
And obviously, even if a vaccine's approved, it's going to take a long time to mass produce hundreds of millions of doses to distribute in the United States alone, not counting the rest of the world.
Right.
You're talking several billion doses of this vaccine. Obviously, other companies around the world would be manufacturing as well. What about other drugs, doctor, in terms of any other therapies, frontline therapies that are in clinical trials now?
At this point, we are probably in the process of doing what's called monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19. So this is basically, instead of giving the plasma, you take the B cells and you do what's called pooling antibodies. You take these B cells, you clone them, and you fabricate antibodies. And then instead of giving the plasma from a person, you give that just the immunoglobulin to that person, the same way we do for hepatitis B. You get hepatitis B immunoglobulin just for protection. It's going to be almost the same thing for COVID-19. I think this is going to be the new hotspot now about new development in the management of COVID-19. And I think a lot of institutions will be involved in that trial. And I'm very happy with that trial because it's been experienced before. We know exactly the efficacy, we know the process, and anytime you produce filtered or purified antibodies in the system, it's way safer than take it from somebody and push it in the human body. So this is one of the new things probably is going to come very shortly. But in the meantime, we still have the same treatment. We have steroids at the front line, especially useful for people who are having hypoxemia or drop in the oxygen level or being on the respirator. This is how you show that improvement in mortality only. If somebody has no breathing problem, if somebody has no drop in the oxygenation, that medication won't work. The only time it works when your oxygen dropping less than 94%, if you have pneumonia, and if you are on mechanical ventilation, and you can cut down mortality by 1/3 of the cases, which is great. The other product is remdesivir, but again, from even previous randomized controlled trials, there is no impact on mortality. It can cut down on the length of stay from 15 days to 11 days by 1/3 almost, but has no major impact on mortality. The other thing we do as well is convalescent plasma, and it was given EUA, emergency use authorization by FDA, based on safety and efficacy. And the beauty about convalescent plasma, you have to give it early within the first 72 hours, and you have to pick the plasma from somebody who has high concentration of antibodies. If you can do that, definitely you can help the other person who is suffering devastating complication from COVID-19. The other things that we do is we're tweaking the management of mechanical ventilation. We know exactly what to do better compared to before. We try to push longer before we put somebody on mechanical ventilation. If we do so, we have to manage very well the pressure, the tidal volume, how much volume we push in the lung, what are the settings. So we have a little bit more experience about how to manage these patients with mechanical ventilation. On the other hand, we have other options, vitamin C, vitamin D, B1. All these vitamins can help to boost the immune system to help with that. And what we learned also from COVID-19, that 1/3 of the patients with COVID-19, they increase the chance of having clot in the legs or in the lungs, as well as heart attack. So we are on the top of that and try to capture these problems as early as possible.
I've read some other studies that younger people who have had COVID-19 and seem to recover are having inflammation around the heart and those types of issues. Are you familiar with that?
Some people basically, they have what's called pericarditis, which is inflammation of the layer around the heart, but this is not very common, but this is one of the options sometimes we can see with COVID-19, unfortunately.
Do we know yet whether if someone has recovered from COVID, if they have actually will develop natural immunity from a reinfection? I saw one report of an individual who had seemingly recovered, but then apparently had contracted the disease again.
So like you mentioned, that this is and I have to delve into the physiology of it. So that guy from Singapore, he got the infection back in March, and he was in the hospital just for isolation, released after 2 PCR negative, and he went to Spain, and then came back again to Singapore, and he was tested positive. So when they did the analysis, these two strains from before and after were completely different. So this is not the same strain. One European strain and one Singapore strain. But when they did the analysis, after day 5, that guy immediately started to develop antibodies. And this is basically very important and very promising, which means that guy has what's called memory cells or T cells that can develop immunity immediately after exposure. And basically that guy at the second time didn't have any symptoms, which means that the old infection created some sort of immunity to prevent the development of disease when he got the second reinfection. So that's why I want to make the distinction between reinfection and disease, because I don't care about getting reinfected as long as they don't have the disease. And this is basically what's important. And if you look at there is also the fishing ship as well. I think 122 crews on that ship, and they tested 120 before they go to the ship, and then after they went after they sailed, they got an outbreak on the ship, and 104 people got infected. The only 3 people who did not get infected are the people who've been priorly exposed and they had the immunoglobulins. So all these are reassuring that infection can give you some sort of protection, and this is good for the vaccination.
There are those people in our society who think we need to follow a herd immunity strategy where when so many people have been exposed to the disease, that it's no longer will be able to be transmitted in any significant numbers. I heard Dr. Fauci say that that's not a mitigation strategy and that a lot of people would die before you got to that level. What's your position on that?
So if you do that, this is what we call the human challenges. So this is very unethical. If you have a disease causing mortality around 4 or 5%, this is absolutely unethical to do that. And if you want to go to do herd immunity, you need 70, 80% to stop the infection from spreading. And this is not going to happen. Even in New York, when they got hit the hardest in the United States, and when they did the zero testing on patients, barely they hit the 23%. So that idea of herd immunity, it's impossible in the United States, and the only option will be vaccination.
I mean, if you think about it, the Spanish flu, like 675,000 individuals approximately died from the Spanish flu in 1918, and the U.S. population was nowhere near where it is today. So the numbers of the mortality would be incredible. And as Dr. Fauci mentioned, that is just simply an ethical approach.
Well, and I can speak personally on that. My great-grandmother passed away from the Spanish flu when my grandfather was a young boy. And, you know, him and his sister grew up without a mother. And when you start hearing people talk about herd immunity, if you look at the statistics of roughly 70% of the U.S. population, you're talking around 230 million people. And if you start saying, okay, 230 million people and you're going to have 4 or 5% mortality, that's a lot of people would have to die, not counting how many would be extremely ill and have. One other thing I want to mention, going along that same lines, is a lot of people who recovered do have ongoing symptoms. Is that true?
Yeah, some of them, especially people like having severe infection, being in the hospital for severe pneumonia, even after leaving the hospital, they may still having some problem with breathing. Because going back to the point, that infection can cause a lot of scar tissue in the inlying of the lungs. And it may take long time to recover from that. Sometimes you cannot recover from that. So that scar tissue is irreversible at a certain point.
Before we get into wrapping the program up,
Okay.
I think, Tammy, you wanted to ask you had some questions for me earlier that we probably need to address.
I did. And, you know, and I'll reference back before I do to the chart that I showed where I showed the weekly numbers. And I like that chart because that really is a nice visual, I think, that our behaviors, we talked a lot about vaccine and treatment, and there's a lot of hope, right, Dr. Fauci? There's a lot of hope to building up immunity in response to disease versus infection, and hopefully vaccines that are on their way and treatments improving, and we're understanding more and more. We're learning every day more about this. But that weekly numbers just of Pike County, I think such a nice visual of our behaviors directly impact the outcomes. I mean, until we have a vaccine, that is going to continue to be the case, is that our behaviors, you know, mask compliance, social distancing, cleaning, good solid hygiene habits. This is just really the main resource that we currently have. So I just wanted, to bring that to the topic before we wrapped up. But we are seeing increased compliance, and we have fairly successfully in Eastern Kentucky and Pike County specifically been able to open the restaurants and the economy back up slowly. And we've been fairly effective with that. But I know many people have asked about like the government services, what's available, and where are we with the parks and recreation in the county, and what are some of your recommendations, Judge?
Well, we have opened all the county parks back up. My executive order that opened the parks back up did mandate social distancing other than your family unit. If you're within 6 feet of someone else, and we're not wearing a mask when we're talking here because we're actually more than 6 feet apart. We've encouraged people to use hand sanitizer, make sure that they're wiping down the playground equipment. And that was one of the reasons that we did shut the parks down. We had instances where people were playing pickup ball games. They were having picnics, family gatherings. And the county really doesn't have the resources to be able to maintain those facilities and guarantee that they're sanitized between uses. We have not reopened the community centers throughout the county. We are working on a plan to do that. Our biggest concern is, in the past, you could rent it to 2 different groups on the same day. You didn't have to worry about anything other than just routine cleaning. Well, now you have to have deep cleaning. You have to have, doorknobs have to be sanitized. You just don't go in and, sweep it up and wipe the tables down. It has to be done in a certain way. We are working on a plan to do that. The courthouse is open. We do ask that people have their temperature taken and give a medical history if, of any, fever, COVID exposure when they come in. We've got it marked on the floor. We've got it marked even in the fiscal courtroom to space people out when they come in. Mm-hmm. So we're doing everything we can. And fortunately, at this point, we have not had a single county employee become infected with COVID. We have worked closely with the jail administration. To this point, we've had no inmates in the Pike County Detention Center who've contracted COVID. Sheriff Scott's done a great job with his department. He's not had anyone in his department contract COVID. We have had individuals in county government who have had to be quarantined for a couple of weeks because of the risk of contracting it or being exposed to someone. But we've worked diligently to protect our workforce as well as the public. Our solid waste system's still running. All the county government services. Our senior citizens program that we help fund has continued to serve meals to every person that needs a meal. The centers are shut down because obviously the aging population that uses those, we don't want gatherings. But our senior citizens program has done a remarkable job under Diane Thacker and has continued to serve senior citizens throughout the county.
Now, you've definitely gone above and beyond to protect those that are vulnerable and to keep the residents safe with the parks and recreation. I know I'm getting a lot of calls about Halloween. So we're already getting those calls and asking about trick-or-treat and Halloween fall-type activities. I know that there's a potential drive-through type event in the city, which would not be like a trick-or-treat event. But what are your thoughts about Halloween and trick-or-treat?
The city is doing a drive-through Nightmare on Main. And, my kids love going over to the Expo Center and, seeing everybody dressed up. And it's great for the business community. To have people come through, it helps a lot of kids. And it's not just kids from Pike County. We've had kids come through when I've participated in it from West Virginia. We've had kids come through from Pound and Norton, all the surrounding counties. Obviously, that's not possible this year. And it's also not possible to do that in as big as the county is. We are going to wait and see where we are in terms of the numbers. And ultimately, it will be you and Dr. Foddy that will have significant input on what I do in terms of Halloween. The one thing we don't want to do is risk exposing people to COVID-19, and particularly children. So, and by that point in time, we'll see what's happened with the reopening of the schools. The more information we have, the better off we are.
Right. And that Nightmare on Main event, I don't believe they're proceeding with that in the normal nature. That will not be an indoor event, and I don't believe the kids will be participating like outside of their vehicles.
I think it's a drive-through event. Right. And, at some point, the first thing is we've got to protect the kids.
Right.
As a parent of 3 kids, they weren't happy when I rescheduled Halloween last year, but we had a large weather system moved in. Mm-hmm. And I made the decision that I'm not going to have a bunch of children out in the middle of thunderstorms and heavy rain trying to trick or treat. There's a safety issue there. And it's not worth getting one child injured. Right. And particularly in this situation, it's not worth exposing one child to COVID.
Safety first, for sure.
Absolutely.
And we appreciate that, Judge Jones. Probably the next most frequent question that I'm being asked is about the polling, the upcoming election and the polling situation. And I know the way that you did it back in the primary, there were 5 distinct locations, and that seemed to work really well. Do you know what the plan is for this November?
Well, the County Board of Elections has mandates from the state. Governor Beshear and Secretary of State Michael Adams have worked together to develop a plan in a bipartisan way to make sure that people or it's easier actually for many people to vote, but while also protecting people from potential exposure to COVID. The state limits the number of polling places for the counties. In Pike County, in-person voting will take place at each of the high schools, as well as Millard Elementary. In addition, there will be 3 additional locations, one in Prestonsburg, one in Coal Run, one in Elkhorn City, because there will be city elections as well. I'm not sure that those 3 locations have been picked yet, but I received this in the mail, and it is from Kentucky, one of the political parties, but it basically doesn't really have anything to do with who you vote for or anything else, but it says you can, if you want to get an absentee ballot, it's got directions on there. GoVoteKY.com. You can do it that way. I'm not sure if that's the official site. I don't want to give that out. That is one site. There are other, you can go on the State Board of Elections website, should have a link, and you can call the county clerk's office. They will give you information on that. Basically, you can vote by absentee ballots. I think you can also do vote in person starting October 13th at the county clerk's office.
So there's early voting.
Early voting,
Okay.
and that's what I did last. I just went down to the clerk's office and voted. We want to make sure that people have the right to vote, or that protect that right to vote and have access to voting places. A lot of people are concerned about mail-in voting. I'm not so concerned about that. There's been no evidence of fraud. The way it's done, think about how much money that goes through the mail, the postal system. People pay bills through the mail. They get paid, through the mail. Social Security checks, for years have come through the mail. Those are the kind of things. Our mail system is very reliable. It's unfortunate that we can't have regular elections. The thing I'm concerned about, how long is it going to take to count the votes? It's obviously a lot easier to have electronic tabulation on election night versus, waiting for several days to know the outcome. I think that's what a lot of people are concerned about. But those are the main ways. Absentee ballot request, you can vote early, or you can vote at one of the 9 locations that will be specified by the Board of Elections.
Traditionally. I know we
Yes.
worked very closely with the county clerk's office and the sheriff's office prior to the primary, and not just cleaning but disinfecting, which there's a slight difference, but how to disinfect after each and every vote on the machine. So we did work very closely with them during the primaries. I'm sure we will in the general.
Well, if anyone has questions, they can call the judge's office. They probably need to give us a little bit of time till the local Board of Elections finalizes everything. But if anyone has questions, they can call us. We'll try to point them in the right direction. But again, starting on October 13th, Rhonda Taylor's office, there in the courthouse, you'll be able to, if you come in to tag a vehicle, if you come in to pay a solid waste bill, if you're just in town on business, you can come by and vote.
That's great. Thank you for that update.
All right, before we conclude the program, Tammy, just give us some food for thought, what we need to be doing to protect ourselves and our families and our friends, and then we'll let Dr. Foddy wrap us up.
Well, as I said a minute ago, our actions and behaviors, there's a direct correlation between that and the numbers locally. So if we want to continue, I know football season's upon us, and we want to see the end of football season successfully. We want, more importantly, to see our kids go back on the flex schedule or in person to school. and to be able to stay there. Our behaviors and actions, there's a direct correlation between that and the outcome of those events and decisions. So I implore, as I have from early on, wear your mask while interacting with others, social distance, 6 feet or more as we are, stay calm, get your information from reliable resources like the health department, kycovid19.ky.gov, or as you mentioned, you have a website, Judge, you have a Facebook, you're very accessible. Anyone can call your office if you're not there. Jeannie or Anita, one takes the calls. They're very helpful. Get your information from reliable resources. There's a lot of rumors and myths out there. And clean, cover, and contain. Clean your hands. Keep your face covered. Stay home if you're sick.
One of the biggest concerns I have is a lot of people get information from social media, Facebook in particular.
Yes.
And there's a lot of information on there. It's just simply not accurate.
Yes.
I'll just touch on that real quick. Dr. Fadi, is there a cure for COVID-19?
At this point, there is no cure for COVID-19. So this is not a cure. So we don't have any antiviral agent proven to decrease mortality for COVID-19 so far. So as from antiviral therapy, no, we don't have any FDA-approved agent for COVID-19 so far.
What are your recommendations to the public in terms of protecting themselves, protecting their families?
I think Mr. Raleigh did a great job talking about the protective measures. So mitigation measures continue to be the best weapons we have now, like mask when you're in public, try to keep the physical separation, washing hands, try to be very cautious with any decision you're making. I think this is going to be probably the best option at this point until we get the vaccination approved. This is number one. Number two, flu vaccination is extremely important now. And based on the CDC guideline, you can take it in October, because usually the peak is somewhere between December, January, February. So this is going to be basically the time. Mm-hmm. And usually it takes 2 weeks to kick in and start to work. So I highly recommend people to start taking the vaccination for the flu in the beginning of October. And this will give them 6 months of protection. On the other hand, I want to basically reach out to the young population, especially the young kids, like teens and young adults, about vaping. Vaping is not a good thing to do, because vaping has too much nicotine in it and too much chemicals that can destroy your lung. And based on all the studies we've seen, we have more positive COVID-19 in that population compared to the people who do not vape or smoke cigarettes. So be careful about what you're doing, especially do not share any product with anybody else, because by sharing, you pass the infection from one person to another person. And this is a common behavior in young population. They share vaping and cigarettes, and don't do that, please.
Well, thank you all very much for coming on to the program. When Tammy called and said we need to do an update, I was in agreement with that. We've not been doing a lot of televised updates. We want people to have the most recent information. We want people to be able to make good decisions, and we're going to continue to do the program updates as needed. If any of you have at the health department or at the hospital have additional information that you want to get out to the public, let us know. If the public has questions about what we need to do in terms of protecting ourselves, or if they think they've been exposed, they can call the Pike County Health Department and get all the information that they need. So thank you for tuning in. And again, thanks to Ms. Riley and Dr. Fadi for coming on the program. You all have done a great job for the people of the county. I truly believe that the pandemic would have hit our county much harder, but for the work that the two of you have done, and it's very much appreciated.
I think that we have to give credit for people because they're following recommendation, because we can give advice, we can give recommendation, but we have definitely to commend on people who are the most valuable players in this game. So big shout to the people who are following our recommendations.
Absolutely.
And they make our area very safe.
Again,
and a great leader, Judge.
Well, I don't know. Well, we'll see.
And a great leader.
I was waiting on you to say that.
It's been a rough year. So we just pray we pray that this pandemic ends, and remember those people who have been impacted in your prayers. And a lot of families have been have faced some very hard consequences from this virus, and we will remember those people who've been impacted by it.
Absolutely.
So thank you again for tuning in, and This is Ray Jones, Pike County Judge Executive. We will keep you updated as things change here on the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.